Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back to the Director's Chair. This again is our weekly live stream forum here at Into Growth, in which we are exploring the intersection of leadership and creativity. In our dialogue leading up to today, we've been looking at how we as leaders can sharpen our creative edge and ways that we can intentionally cultivate a more creative mindset in ourselves and ultimately, again, fulfill the responsibility of bringing out the creative energy of our teams. Before we jump in on today's topic, kick off our discussion, I'll take a moment here to briefly recap where we've been and what has brought us up to today. So we've had a couple of common threads and themes in our discussions today. One, we've looked at the traits that highly creative leaders and teams inherently have or can actively cultivate or cast into their teams and others. We've looked at fierce optimism, curiosity, authenticity, courage, and several others. The tools, number two, we've looked at the tools that we as leaders can employ to cultivate and drive the creative process, including storytelling, improvisation, creativity, and conflict and confrontation as well. And we've recently started on a third pillar or theme for our discussions, being the obstacles or constraints and potential enemies to the creative process. We've looked at apathy, or a loss of care that and the will to continue the valuable and necessary struggle that any venture, creative or otherwise, must entail. Conflict and confrontation actually being a tool to help to fight this. And last week, we looked at the dangers of pursuing an overly perfectionistic mindset in the creative process, being cautious to view that as adaptive or maladaptive, as Laura outlined for us. We looked at the beauty and benefit of the imperfect in achieving highly innovative outcomes as well. And so today we're going to continue on this thread, that being the thread of enemies or obstacles to the creative process, that it is our responsibility as leaders to remove or obviate for our teams to whatever extent possible. So we're going to visit another perceived or potential enemy or constraint to the creative process, being our so very often limited resources, and how the resources we do and do not have at our disposal can impact our mindset as creative leaders and creative teams, and our likelihood of achieving the innovative outcomes that we're striving for. So this is perhaps incredibly, maybe even more so relevant right now in times of economic downturn, when resources are scarce, and when we all, and especially earlier stage ventures, might need to tighten the belt a bit more and make do with what we have. So we're going to talk about this today, and how and whether or not we can maintain a MacGyver mindset, if you will, in spurring our creative energies and those of our teams. So Brian, if you don't mind, I'll put you in the director's chair here for a second. As a three-time CEO, creative yourself, I know you've been in many a situation where budget constraints were a real challenge. And so the question here would be, are limited resources, should we look at them as a constraint, or could they be a potential catalyst for creativity? And, whichever direction we go there, under what circumstances might that be the case?
Well, I'm, interestingly enough, I'm really excited about this conversation, because scarce resources should drive creativity. And what happens in times like this, where nearly every business across the world is they're going through cuts, and some are going to be very, very material, and we're only at the beginning of what those cuts might be. So that is scary, but it's also exciting in a lot of ways. For example, Warren Buffett has said for years, and it was attributed, I was at a conversation yesterday, it was attributed to me as if it was original to me, but of course it's not. And he said, when people are swimming naked, once the tide runs out. And so what's going to happen now across nearly every business vertical in the world is people are going to look for those performers who looked okay for a while, but maybe they were involved in team selling, or maybe the company was doing so well. So my point is, it's like Amazon, they have buildings, as you probably were aware, they have buildings that are named different things, like Day One. And Jeff Bezos always said you have to behave as if you're a startup every single day. And almost everyone loses that. In good times, people throw abundance on their employees. They have, free lunches every day, and there is no such thing as a free lunch. So what happens is, I think ultimately what we're going through right now, obviously the impact on human beings, loss of lives, illness, horrific, horrible. But ultimately, from a business perspective, we'll be far better off for it, because all of us are learning to live in an environment of constraints. For example, using the use of the modern tools, overabundance with office space, unnecessarily so in many ways. So right now, I think this overabundance that we've had for the past 7 or 8 years isn't really good for human beings. It's not really good for business. So I'm, for one, while it's tragic what's happening, I'm excited about the change, because we don't need this overabundance to be creative and to win and to lead businesses. We just don't need them. So I'll start there, but I have all kinds of examples, but I'll leave it there and you guys go ahead and react to it.
Yeah. So
I want to dig in on that overabundance part. And not only is it just an overabundance, but sometimes these overabundances can be distractors, right? And so if you are trying to truly be creative and you have all these resources, oh, there's this and there's this, you're no longer thinking of, what is the best, solution for this problem, or it's throwing everything but the kitchen sink at something because you can. So it really gets into distractors rather than really figuring out what is necessary. You and your team sitting down and thinking what is truly necessary to solve this problem, this solution, what do we need to do? Because sometimes it just gets too clogged with all the clutter in the world.
Yeah.
I'll give you, because this is the director's chair, and I'll give you an example from Broadway. In January, I saw David Byrne's American Utopia. So many of us are familiar with David Byrne from the Talking Heads. How did the days go by? That kind of guy. So anyway, I went to a show on Broadway called American Utopia. And sometimes you go to Broadway shows and it seems like they overdo the production, they overdo everything, because I think oftentimes they believe they don't have a good product. And you have to over-engineer because you don't have a good product. So David Burns goes out on stage, and all they have are these is an interesting. They have 11 musicians that accompany him, and it's just all gray, and it's all creative movements with the curtains. It cost them, other than David's probably expensive, cost them almost nothing. But it was so powerful, it was so creatively done, and it was minimal. And then I go see Britney Spears, which I did in Vegas about 2 years ago, and it was a disaster because they over-engineered it because they were worried they didn't have a good product.
Over the top. Yeah.
Over the top. It was a disaster. So my point is, what's happening today is people their best are going to get more creative, and they're going to survive. And not only survive, they're going to thrive. And you can do a heck of a lot more with less. We've always been able to do a lot more with less. Always.
So bottom line here, an overabundance of resources, put simply, you've no incentive to use what's available to you in novel ways. But once you're just gonna fall into a default mode of using a chair as a chair, for example, not thinking of other ways to use what you have at your disposal, and just get too comfortable. We get lazy. Bottom line.
Well, an example would be, obviously, I'm excited about this topic. We all see the CGI of everything in Hollywood, and there's nothing as powerful as a great story. When you don't have a great story, you end up CGIing everything, special effects, everything, because you think that's what you want to distract the audience because your product sucks. Your story sucks. So let me over CGI this and spend $100 million on it and lose $100 million or whatever. It's crazy. So what I'm saying to you is anytime you feel like you're trying to over-engineer stuff and overspend on stuff, look at your story, look at your product. Maybe it sucks. Maybe it's not very good. And you need to redo that in a very simple, easy to sell, easy to use kind of format. And you'll be okay.
See, the ideal situation is when you have when you're continuing to maintain the mindset and mentality that you're running a startup every day of the week, regardless of the level of resources you have. And ideally, you have both a good story and some resources to throw at it. But when you don't, you're forced into a situation where you have the mental license to look at things differently in more novel or unique sorts of ways as well.
Right.
Good. So, Laura, I'm curious here, and Laura, maybe I'll put you on the spot here, put you in the director's chair here for a second. Psychologically, this has got to do something to us too. When we have a sense that there's a scarcity, many of us, like right now, and to Brian's point, we're heading into a period where lots of organizations are looking at cuts. There's a greater sense of urgency, maybe kind of a fire lit under our collective behinds in some respects, and that does something to us too. That can feel constraining. That can feel like I don't feel like I have license to be creative. But I think to Brian's point here, that can actually be a catalyst for us to get moving and get more creative as well. The sense of kind of like what happens to us when we're viewing things differently, when we move into a different mode there, even with some of the anxiety that can sometimes bring, which feels like it takes away the creative energy.
Yeah, no, great question. So I think it's important for us to just understand that humans are going to be inherently lazy, right? So whether it's mental energy or physically energy, we try to take the path of least resistance. And so if we are in a resource-rich environment, we're not going to think creatively or in innovative ways. Excuse me, as you said, a chair is just a chair because we don't have to. So if we're not forced to take that extra energy to be thinking about things in a creative way, which when we're in a time of abundance, we're not going to do that because we don't have to. And so I think psychologically what's really important is that when you are resource constrained, you are forced to think outside of the box. You're forced to engage this innovative and creative thinking, this solution-oriented thought process, right? That in a resource-abundant environment, you're not forced to do because you don't have to. So a couple of examples, right, that I think everyone can probably relate to. So especially during COVID. So I have been trying to go to the store as infrequently as possible, right? So it comes to like, week 2, week 3, and I'm like, oh man. And if I was in a resource abundant environment, I would be like, I'm ordering in or I'm going out, but instead I'm looking at my fridge and I'm like, all right, well, I have this and I have this and oh, maybe I can throw this together and make this pasta. Like you're forced to get creative. Whereas if I wasn't trying to stretch my resources, I would not be doing that. I would just be ordering in or going to the store so that I could make these like, more abundant, elaborate meals. I also think of it as, when I lived in New York and I was going into an office every day and I would not have picked up my stuff from the dry cleaner and I didn't have any clothes. And it was like, it's so easy to look in your closet and be like, I don't have any clothes. But that's not true. You can usually be like, oh, if I piece this together and I put this scarf on, you're like, I have something. And so I think that those are 2 real life examples of our cognitive ability to look at our resources when they are limited and realize, wait a second, I can actually make something of this. Whereas when you have abundance, you're not going to do that. You're like, oh, good, this is straight from the dry cleaner. Oh, let me just order this in.
So that while Laura was eating a peanut butter and ketchup sandwich the other day.
Exactly. And sometimes
no, but I mean, I think that I love the analogy, Laura. I think that's perfect. I mean, that's exactly right. It forces you to think outside the box. Not only that, but it gives us as people like a can-do attitude. If something there's no task that's too big or too small, and you're like, okay, well, let me get into granular here. I'm usually used to just reading the back of a box and putting lunch together or putting dinner together. But now let me try and use like the creative side of my brain to really like empower myself to do something about it. So it really gets rid of that laziness. And also if you think about like if it's a resource, restricted type of a thing, I'm no longer relying on somebody else. Oh, that's not my lane. That's Brian's lane or that's Laura's lane. No, it's like, this is all our lane. It gets rid of these different silos. Let's all come in this together. Let's use our resources. I need to make this phone call. Great. I don't need to dish that out to somebody. So it really builds that teamwork that I think is essential to doing anything creative.
So key here is like without constraints, things play out very, very differently, right? We're dedicating our mental energy to just being more resourceful. Laura, I love I love that you took us to the kitchen in that example. Tom, I know you like to spend time in the kitchen as well. I've never been much myself. I do eggs very well. That's about it. And I'm told by the girls that I do. But I'm struggling to think of a couple of examples. But there are recipes that like have become common staples that would never have come about were it not for periods of intense economic hardship where we just didn't have some of the trimmings and trappings that we would have liked to have had. I'm struggling to think of some of those really good examples. But,
my family's favorite meal. It's been in my family for 80 years. We didn't have a lot of money for generations in our family. And it's called chili mac. And today it's my kids' favorite meal. You can make it, feed a family of 6 for like 3 days for $30.
Yeah.
And my grandmother, Arp, Didn't have a lot of money, but it was delicious, and I'm happy to give. In fact, I have put the recipe online before. So if I can make a comment about, once you give people a resource-rich environment, it's very difficult to take that back. And you need something like this to refresh. And I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was asked to take over a startup by VCs. And this startup had raised $135 million, but had virtually no customers. And it spent like crazy. My first day in the job, I said, my God, you got 3 floors of the Taj Mahal in New York City. You have offices all over the world. I said to the CFO, what are all these free lunches? $250,000 a year on free lunches for a relatively company. My point is, we moved out of the offices, we got rid of the free lunch as much as we can. But once you pull back, the cultural impact, especially in a resource-rich environment, is excruciating. So this comes down, we have an opportunity. Every leader of every company everywhere has an opportunity to reset. Because it's no longer, you have to reset, and it comes down to leadership. You can't pull that, you can. It's very difficult to pull that back once you've already established a privileged environment. We have an opportunity to lead now.
So it sounds like, so in this situation, Brian, to your point, like we're now in a situation now where writ large, just across the board, the great equalizer, as some would refer to it, this is forcing everyone to varying degrees to take a more resource constrained approach to things.
I think it's time to re-lead. It's time to re-lead now. And I think it's going to be wonderful for the economy in the long run, wonderful for businesses, and we're going to really thrive because we're all going to be like a Walmart or an Amazon, meaning really excruciatingly efficient with our time and our resources. It's going to be wonderful.
Slimming down and getting highly efficient here. But so I'm curious here, and let's take this to the kind of let's turn this next corner in our conversation. In those environments where, like, this will happen throughout history, right? Periods of economic downturn when we are forced, again, writ large, for us all to approach things with a more resource constrained mindset, to get more creative with what we have at our disposal, get more novel in how we approach the enterprise, how we feed our families with Chili Mac or others. But in those environments where we start seeing the fruit of our efforts, we start seeing more resources come back, we start getting comfortable again. How can we as leaders ensure that we're continually maintaining that resource constrained mindset with our teams? Because I think those are the organizations, those are the teams that are going to continue to excel even in times of economic prosperity, and things are coming back as well. So I'll open that up here. What are some things that we can do to ensure that we're maintaining that same compass?
If you don't mind, I'll start.
Please.
Words matter and tone from the top. One of my favorite sayings is comfort. And by the way, it's a saying that many don't like so much because it seems so morbid, but comfort is where everything goes to die. Your businesses, your relationships, your institutions, your government. So the words that we use matter, and how we lead from example, it really matters. Let's take Amazon. 10 years ago, I was president of a company called McGraw-Hill. And I was in Seattle, and I just took a few of the Amazon executives out. These guys are obviously crazy successful, and many had been at Amazon almost since the beginning. So it's not like they were broke. And I think we went to Panera or something. But when I offered to pay for lunch, the level of relief across these, I'm sure, many times over millionaires was incredible, because they were in the middle of a competition to see who can spend the least. I was like, I'm happy to pick up your sandwiches, guys and women. It was crazy. But but crazy good in a way, because they had never lost that, even though that they were crazy successful. And Amazon has been obviously an unbelievable story over the past 25 years. They were in a competition to see who can spend the least.
Yeah. Good point. I wonder if also, like, different activities that we could take on with our teams, right? Tone from the top matters, and if we're constantly reinforcing the fact that comfort is where everything goes to die, and that we want to see more done with less, and that those that are doing more with less are rewarded, that's going to help us maintain a consistent mindset throughout the organization as well. I think this point probably holds true as well, where you see multiple examples of different competitions where it's not just, well, we want to see who can put out the best X, Y, or Z. We want to see who can put out the best and most creative idea under these limitations. And let's see what you can do with that. This is all you have at your disposal. Go forth and do. That changes the dynamic greatly. And then you see, really, Brian, to your point, who is swimming naked out there as well. So,
or to Warren Buffett's point.
To your point. Well, we like to attribute a lot to you, Brian. You're an incredibly original guy. So,
well, let's take
Who's Warren Buffett? I only know Brian.
This is the director. So, are you familiar? Do you remember? It had to be 15 years ago. That film, it was called The Blair Witch Project. Do you remember that? Where, I don't know, a couple kids, I don't know the exact story behind it. They just had a handheld cam. And they created this whole scary woods thing, Blair Witch Project thing with a handheld camera. I'll bet it cost them $20,000 to make that entire film, and it made tens of millions of dollars. So things like that. As a metaphor, give your team, here's a camera, here's a video camera, do something with that. I'll see you in 3 days. And I'm going to reward the most creative, whatever the situation is. Blair Witch Project as a metaphor. There are ways to do it. It just takes some creativity and some fun. Make it fun.
Good.
I like that. I think that.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I do think that, tone from the top is so important. Whether it's, creating these circumstances where you have to cultivate that kind of limited or resource constrained environment so that people are forced to be innovative. And to Tom's point, that does empower people, right? It gets people more involved. If you just have a lean company, then people are more likely to be engaged because they're going to be more interested in what they're doing, and they're going to be doing more collaborative things across the board. As we said, like, I'm not in this lane, like everyone is working across a lot of different functions and roles and projects, which I think is just engaging and interesting for people. But I also think that, tone from the top leaders can help to cultivate a mindset of gratitude and, like, don't forget where we came from, or don't forget what we've been through. Because it's so easy to just, when you're in those times of comfort, you don't remember what it felt like to be uncomfortable. You don't remember what it felt like to have to stretch a dollar or groceries, or, not have all of these, tech applications or whatever else it is that just makes your efficiency and your day-to-day productivity easier. So I think that's just, something that's really important. And one thing I always think of is that I remember being, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8, and I was walking in a parking lot with my dad, and I stepped over a penny, and he was like, "Why don't you pick it up?" And I was like, "It's just a penny." And he went into such a lecture about do not ever take anything for granted, and do not, just because something seems to be a slight amount, that is not, we're not people who take things for granted, and we worked really hard to get where we are. So we have to be appreciative of the smallest things.
And that really stuck with you.
Absolutely. I think of it all the time. And I think it dictates how I live my life, to be honest.
But Laura, I think that's a really good point. I think, Tom, before you jump in here, I think again, on following this thread of tone from the top, don't forget where we came from and how hard things were. Mm-hmm. Again, to Brian's point, this is the director's chair. That's also one of the key critical elements, I would argue, about any good story. Don't forget our story, humble beginnings. That resonates with people. That resonates with audiences, and it's important here. I think in maintaining that sharper edge as leaders as well. And if the conditions don't exist like they do, like they are increasingly existing now, we as leaders, it's our responsibility to create those conditions in different ways as well. But Tom, you had a point there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in a resource-rich environment, or I'll call it resource-abundant environment, usually there's more money on the table, right? And when there's more money on the table, there's more people involved, more stakeholders. They have a closer eye on what's going on with your team, and the leadership almost hovers over that team, and that pressure can almost be stifling. And we talked about this, ties in directly with our talk last week, that perfection kills that creative process. And so when you get rid of these abundance of resources and pressure from top coming down, it removes that need for things to be perfect. It removes that fear of failure. And when you remove that fear of failure and that maladaptive perfectionism we talked about yesterday, that's when things can actually start happening on a team. And so it's important just to keep that creative process going by removing that fear of failure as a leader. And once Brian talked about, once you give those resources, it's hard to take away. Because then when you take them away, as Laura said, me included, I'm a person, we're naturally lazy, right? And so when I have these resources taken away, what's the first thing the team goes, oh, I can't do that. I don't have this, or I don't have that, or I don't have that. And you need to be, as a leader, be able to nip that in the bud, be like, yes, I know we don't have that. And the reason why we don't have that is because it was my decision. And the reason why I made this decision, blah, 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 blah. And you get to, we need to really pull our resources together, work together, and go back to that story we talked about, right? And so as a leader, you can take those resources away, but it's key for that communication piece to make sure that it's not stifling people's empowerment. Oh, I can't do this, I can't do that. You really need to make sure you can communicate it in a way that's going to have that empowering function.
Thank you, Tom. So it's like the implication here being, again, to Brian's point, it's very difficult to take those resources away once given. So be very careful about giving them in the first place. Consider very carefully where to place those resources to ensure that they're going to be the best use as well. But Tom, I love that. Go ahead.
Even to that point, Dan. Yeah, even to that point, resources are not bad, right? Resources are great, and sometimes resources are needed, right? If you're trying to build a product or a service, right, you need money to actually create like a minimum viable product today for software, right? You need an IT person to build something. Sure, you need to bring in that resource to do it. I'm not going to be an IT coder anytime soon. I won't be able to do that, right? But you need to make sure that you have, if you're going to give these resources, that they also have a shot clock, or there's a definition to it. Hey, we're bringing this on for so much time till we build this minimal viable product. Once that's done, hey, this resource is going away and we're back to the ideation stage. Whatever it is, it's okay to bring resources in, right? It's not like, no, you can't do it, right? No, of course you can, but make sure that you're not just being, exuberant, and you're being smart with it. And where you do plug it in as a leader, or even if a person on the team, if you're asking for it, hey, sir, ma'am, I'm going back to the military days, I would love to have this. I don't want it to be a crutch for the team, but I just need to build this X, Y, and Z function. Probably only take about this amount of time. I'm happy to give that resource back to the overall company, whatever it is. But if you create that scarcity, like Brian was talking about, people not wanting to spend money and having that competition, people will feel empowered by that too, and almost have a sense of, pride or hubris that, hey, I was able to do this because of me and the people on the team that were able to come together and make something happen, rather than just throw money at it, right? So resources are not bad. We're not saying that at all, but you can throw them in there, but throw a shot clock, throw a definition. Why are we using it? How long will we have it?
I think you made another really important point there, Tom, that it's not just scarcity of resources that can be a very good thing and something a condition we can create as leaders, but scarcity of time is also a valuable tool to use as well, and a valuable catalyst here as well. So if you're when you have a limited time, limited resources, it removes, or it can remove, if you've done the situation right, it can remove that over reliance or over focus on perfection as the outcome, where there is naturally then a fear of failure. Once that's removed, we're in a situation where people are more comfortable to put out ideas. People are more comfortable to innovate and try things and be okay failing, especially if you're leading with the right tone from the top. But also put a shot clock on it, Tom. I like that. If you've got a limited point of time in this, people are gonna put out your MVP very quickly, and we're gonna fail fast, and we're gonna make a lot more progress as we move as well. It's good.
If I can add,
please,
something about that startup that this VCs asked me to come in, and they were burning through cash, and about tone for the top. So we were competing against large education platform companies with combined thousands of reps. And we had 11 reps that we had to hire. We hired for those 11. So the mantra around the office is we had to use modern tools and everything available, PR, everything, to call what we call the illusion of scale. So we were up to good, beat and compete against these massive platform companies. We were able to close 300 institutions, 80,000 students, 1,000 adopting professors across the country with 11 salespeople. because it was just the message of the illusion of scale. How can we be everywhere? Because we can't fly because there's no money. We can't take people out to dinner because there's no money. We can't do physical events so much because there's no money. So you had to use tools like this. You had to create the illusion of scale that the company was called Newton. We had to be everywhere, and we have no money. The illusion of scale. So anyway, you can do it. It's just a matter of re-leading, right? Re-leading and starting from scratch and creating a new kind of culture.
You can create something, even on the stage, Brian, to your point, that feels epic with very limited resources. And it's refreshing to see that. People will want to reward the underdog for doing that as well. I think it's good. Well, thank you guys. This has been an interesting discussion here. So any last thoughts here? Otherwise, I'll go ahead and summarize here for us. I think it was a good note to touch on, Brian. So one, and importantly, an overabundance of resources can actually be a disadvantage in many cases, right? We need to maintain, Brian, to your point, a startup mentality all the time. And an overabundance of resources can be a distraction. And Laura, to your point, we naturally, as humans, follow the path of least resistance. And so with abundance, people simply have no incentive to use what's available to them in novel ways. When we have a sense of scarcity, we then it gives us the freedom and the license to use what we have available to us in less conventional ways, because we have to. Without constraints, we follow the path of least resistance. With constraints, we dedicate our mental energy to being more resourceful, and things will play out in vastly different ways. So it's important for us as leaders in situations where we have maybe an overabundance of resources, we have that blessing to be very thoughtful with how we deploy those resources, Tom, to your point, and maybe do so with time constraints as well. A scarcity of time is also a valuable tool here for all of us in helping to help our teams keep their creative edge as we move out as well. And so if we don't have the conditions of scarcity, we need to be maintaining those conditions as leaders. Don't forget, and again, Laura, to your point, I think this is a good one to end on as well. Not forgetting or remembering where we came from, how hard things may have been, and how humble our beginnings were as well, is a good reminder for people that that's the key to success. And we can become too complacent over time, because Brian, to your point, comfort is where things will go to die. And so we should actually look on, especially these times right now, as a blessing, because it's going to force us. We now have the conditions to get really lean. And hopefully when the tide goes out, we will not be swimming naked. That'll be very clear. So good. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope you'll join us again next week. Again, we do this Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern. And we'll look forward to having you back with us in the director's chair. But until then, make sure that you're maintaining your creative edge. Thanks a lot, guys. Take care. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.